the first century of our game, it was on both sides of the earth, Great Britain and Australia, and that's how the game developed. Now, I'm not going to get into why it's not spread around the world, etc., but ultimately, we had two sides of the world where our game was played, and it was so good for international relations. Put it this way, Roy Francis, who's one of my topics on the Coach Stories podcast, his reputation travelled to Australia and North Sydney signed him. Now it's the other way around. It's the Australian coaches that get signed. Yeah, in the 1970s, when TVs came into our lives, I think rugby league didn't market itself very well in the UK. The crowds were really poor, and there's very much a link between poor administration and poor performance on the field, as Jack Gibson is often quoted as saying that winning starts in the front office. So one of the worst periods for rugby league in the UK was the 1970s, for its image, for crowds. And I think that rot extended itself to performance. Meanwhile, in Australia, it was becoming the most popular sport on the eastern seaboard. Jack Gibson was getting coaching methods from America. It was a lot more sexy, a lot more glamorous, if you like. And then it came to the point where the 1982 Kangaroos swept all before them on a tour of Europe. And we called them the Invincibles. And then 4 years later, they did the same thing. We called them the Indomitables. And they racked up huge scores, winning all their games. Between 1978 and 1988, Great Britain didn't win one test match. So when we perceive where this fixture has got to, this was a golden period for Australia because they were light years ahead in terms of skill, fitness and strength. And England and Great Britain were always playing catch-up after that. But let's put that into some context now. It's actually 19 years since England or Great Britain have beaten Australia in a test match. In the 21st century, 26 games have been played and 3 games have been won by England or Great Britain. England haven't won a game against Australia since 1995, the opening test of the World Cup 30 years ago. Almost to the day. And no wonder Australians have started to become a little bit arrogant. That said, the Kangaroo Tours were still the pinnacle. And I think the big change happened in 2001, the 9/11 atrocity, when some players got together and said, we are not going. It was only because English administrator Maurice Lindsay, my old boss, begged them to come over to save the English game financially, that they ended up coming over just for 3 tests. And I think that was a real key stage in this international malaise, I'll call it. Because Australia brought over a really strong squad for the 2000 World Cup. There wasn't a World Cup again until 2008. Australia also brought over a really strong squad for the 2013 World Cup and won it again in 2017. In between, since 2003, there's been Tri-Nations and 4 Nations, and Australia obviously won most of them. It was only New Zealand that beat them. And gradually, more and more Australian players started dropping out of these things. So, because they could. The 2003 squad, that was the last Ashes series, which was a fantastic series, but me and John Davidson on the Ashes Rugby League podcast, we actually analysed the Australian squad. And it was pretty average. So there was no Joey in there, no Joey Johns. Brett Kamali was a good player, and Craig Gower was a good player, but they weren't the best around at the time. There was second rowers in the centres on the wings. It looked a bit put together, but they still won 3-0. Close games, but 3-0. But you could tell that the arrogance was starting to kick in. Like I said, this century, only 3 of 26 matches have been won by England or Great Britain. The previous 25 years, they won 7. So it's at least a 60% drop, something like that. But I'm going to throw another curveball your way to you, arrogant Australian fans, about this. The last 2 World Club challenges have been won by English sides. You have to go back about another decade for them to have won 2. Prior to that, I think it was 2 in 9. So the last 2 have been won by English sides. Now, I do know that there's Australian and New Zealand players in these British sides, but still, it's important that the English sides get some confidence from that. Yes, some more of the Man of Steel awards have gone to Australian players that don't feature too strongly in the NRL. I understand that. And the quality of Super League imports has dropped. But like I said, when I was referring to the world-class performance plan from 2000 onwards from Sport England, there's a group of players now that are constantly coming through that don't have the same fear about playing against Australia. So in 2018, an Australian side that included Tom Dearden, Bradman Best, and Stephen Crichton, who's now playing for Samoa, played for the Australian schoolboys against England, who included Jack Welsby, Harry Smith, and Morgan Smithies. And England won 2-0 at schoolboy level. And all of those players, apart from Stephen Crichton, are probably going to be playing in the Ashes. So that's a group of lads who aren't concerned about playing Australia. They've not got this mental scar before they kick off. And of course, a few of these players have been involved in World Club Challenge wins since then. If you listen to the last Ashes Rugby League podcast that I did with John last Thursday, episode 17, I think it is, we did an exercise and we think it's one of the weakest Australian sides that has ever travelled to England. And again, the arrogant Australian fans say that it's still too strong for England, but most of the people who are saying this don't know the strength of England. And like I've said, this refereeing is going to be a massive curveball. And I think it's so important for the future of the international game, this series, because if Australia win, despite having such a weak side, comparatively, even though the spine is still strong, okay? So Reece Walsh or Dylan Edwards, Cameron Munster, Nathan Cleary, or Tom Dearden, and Harry Grant at hooker, I still think that's really strong. In the spine, at least. The front rows are not the strongest, the back row's not the strongest, and the centres aren't the strongest. They can be. If Australia manage to win this series, which they are favourites for, I don't know if England or Great Britain will ever win in a series again. Or they may, because next thing there'll be Queensland Cup players playing in kangaroo jerseys. If England manage to win the series, I think Australian Rugby League will then go, hang on a minute, this has gone too far. Because Australian Rugby League has lost World Cup finals and Tri-Nations, Four Nations finals to New Zealand and Anzac tests in the last decade and a bit. But that doesn't seem to have worried them too much in terms of what they do to rise the standard of Australian Rugby League in terms of player pathways, which is something I've been talking about to clubs about. And I just think if England manage to beat them, that could set up a great future of Ashes matches. Because if I know the Australian mentality, they will say, yeah, we didn't have our best. We played you at your ground. Your referees were dodgy. Come out to Sydney and Brisbane, boys. Let's see how you go there. I think it's really important, this series. Make sure you get in touch, admin at rugbyleaguecoach.com.au, at Rugby League Coach on socials. Keep working during this off-season. If you want to be a winner, you know I love your work. Take care. Speak to you next week.